I've lived much of my last decade on the fringes of various radical activist communities. Not a part of any really, but close enough to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And in this time, I've discovered that these communities are similar in many ways to our Unitarian Universalist congregations in the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've seen this especially in the ways that both of these communities react when someone screws up. And when I say screw up, I mean it in the sense of making a mistake, and not necessarily a particularly egregious one. I mean it in the sense of not necessarily knowing the right language to use, or making a comment or acting in a way that is unintentionally oppressive or offensive. Too often, it seems we have just two ways of dealing with such missteps. Either we sit quietly and we stew in our anger, letting it get in the way of our relationship with one another by not even broaching the topic of the offense, or we lash out, getting in the way of the relationship with harsh words and shame. In either scenario, we often end up damaging a relationship that was worth a lot more than whatever that misstep was. And it's unlikely, in either scenario, that we help either ourselves or the other person grow. Now, given the number of times that I have witnessed and been a part of both of these reactions to such mistakes, I was so grateful to read Niao Luan Tran's 2013 blog post on the idea of calling in rather than calling out. Their post from the blog Black Girl Dangerous is called Calling In, a less disposable way of holding one another accountable, and addresses the ways that a culture that focuses on calling one another out for mistakes is not sustainable. Luan asked the question, what does it mean for our work to rely on how we've been programmed to punish people for their mistakes? Now, before I go any further, I want to make it clear, as Luan does in their post, that I am not advocating calling in as the only response to offensive behavior. Anger is a vital tool to building the beloved community. And there are absolutely people and situations that need to be called out for what they are. We need, for example, to call out the too frequent killings of unarmed Black folks at the hands of police, which we saw continue this week with the deaths of Terrence Crutcher and Keith Lamont Scott. We need to call out the Islamophobia that caused someone right here in Nashua to throw rocks at the Islamic Center a couple weeks ago. And we need to listen to the voices of people of color and other marginalized populations when they call white folks and other privileged folks out for our complacency in the face of rampant racism, classism, homophobia, and more. This is not what I am talking about or what Luan was talking about when they wrote their piece on calling in. The situations where calling in may be appropriate are when it is the people we are already in community with, the people with whom we already have relationships, the people with whom we know we have some common ground, when it's those folks who are making mistakes. As Luan writes, I picture calling in as a practice of pulling folks back in who have strayed from us. It means extending to ourselves the reality that we will, and we do, screw up. We stray, and there will always be a chance for us to return. Calling in is a practice of loving each other enough to allow each other to make mistakes, a practice of loving ourselves enough to know that what we're trying to do here is a radical unlearning of everything we've been configured to believe is normal. Now, as I read these words, I can't help but think about covenant. And it's not just because it's our theme for the month. I can't help but think about covenant because it feels like calling in is intrinsically covenantal. After all, isn't that exactly what we ask for in our covenant of right relationship? We covenant to trust in one another's good intentions and recognize that my actions and words have an impact regardless of my intentions. And when we fall out of covenant, we ask for help as we seek to restore our relationship with one another. At its heart, covenant is all about aspiration and promise. In our covenants, we give voice to our aspirations for how we want to be with one another. We give voice to our aspirations for how we want to be in this world. We actually put onto paper what we think it might look like if we were truly living as a beloved community. And we know that there's a pretty good chance that we're not always going to live up to these aspirations. That is why we call them aspirations, after all. If we are living up to our aspirations all the time, then we probably aren't setting those aspirations high enough. In our covenants, we also make promises to one another. I often think that the word promise implies something that should not ever be broken, right? And in the ideal world, that would be wonderful. Doesn't that sound good? A world in which everyone always keeps their promises. But actually, we don't live in the ideal world. We live in the real world. And so we do break our promises, sometimes despite our best efforts. Now, recently I've been listening to a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And the hosts of this podcast are a couple of Harvard Divinity School graduates who explore the Harry Potter books as a kind of sacred text. Each episode, they use a different theme to delve into each chapter. For one of the chapters in the first book, they chose the theme of promise. Promise. And co-host Vanessa Sultan introduced the theme with a beautiful story about how promises really work. She tells about how she went through this period when she was a kid of being just totally obsessed with car crashes and being really worried that her parents were going to die in one. It's one of those kid fears that is just possible enough that it's hard for a parent to comfort. So whenever Vanessa's parents would go out for an evening, she'd get really upset and not want them to go. Her mom would try to reassure her by saying, "I promise we will be okay. I promise that I will see you in the morning." But somehow, even young Vanessa knew that this was a promise that her mom couldn't necessarily keep. She knew that people don't actually get into car accidents on purpose. She knew that it wasn't fully in her mother's control. Grown up, Vanessa explains her younger self's reaction like this: "The futility of that promise really offended me." And I think what it is whenever we feel the need to make a promise, it's a gesture of love. You're trying to address someone else's vulnerability. But if you need to make a promise, then there is also the chance that you can't keep it. And I think that is the beautiful thing about promises, is that we want to create security for someone else, for someone we love. But that's also the sadness of promises, is that you can't make those guarantees. And the sheer fact that you are making a promise, she says, is an acknowledgement that things are out of your hands. It's as if every promise should actually be, I promise I'll try my best. I promise I'll try my best to come home. I promise I'll try my best to be a good friend. I love this way of thinking about promises, the idea that we make promises in part because there is a chance we can't keep them, but also because we know we want to try. This is exactly the kind of promises that we make in our covenants. We make promises that we really, really want to be able to keep. We make promises that we are going to try our best to follow through on, even though we know that there's always a chance that we'll fall short. So aspiration and promise, two of the essential ingredients of covenant. In our covenants, we set ourselves high standards for our behavior. We set out what it would look like to be our best selves. And then we promise we'll try our best to live into those aspirations, knowing that we can't guarantee it. But covenants don't just end with promises or broken promises. There's one more essential ingredient, and that is forgiveness. Our covenants demand that we aspire high, we make promises and try our best to keep them, and then when we fall short, when we inevitably fall short, that we stay in relationship with one another, offering forgiveness and calling each other back in to covenant. Being in covenant means we don't just give up when promises are broken. We don't choose one of those two paths I described earlier, sitting quietly and stewing, or lashing out and walking away. Instead, we seek to remain in relationship with one another. One of the more powerful examples I have seen of persisting in relationship with one another, even when we've been disappointed, was actually in one of our Unitarian Universalist congregations. When I arrived at that congregation, there had recently been a rift because of a tumultuous departure of a minister. There were factions. There were those who had wanted the minister to stay, and there were those who had been a part of asking the minister to leave. And there were some who did leave the church altogether, who chose to walk away, who did not try to repair the community. But most people stayed. And the congregation held a series of conversations over the next 2 years where they listened to one another. In their conversations, they sought to hear one another, to really hear, and to be heard. And they realized that they did indeed still have a common purpose together, that mistakes had been made on all sides, but that they all wanted what was best for the congregation, that each of them was acting out of love. By the time I left that congregation, that rift was healed, or mostly healed. Most folks didn't even remember who had been on which side anymore. The wounds that had once seemed so deep and painful had, in fact, healed, leaving just little scars in their place. They had called one another back into relationship. They had called one another back into covenant, not with harsh words or shame, but by speaking honestly and thoughtfully, listening intently, loving each other enough to return and repair. None of this was done without work. No one ever has claimed that covenant is easy. It's never easy, in fact, for us fallible humans to remain in relationship with other fallible humans. As Luan says, it means extending to ourselves the reality that we will and do screw up, we stray, and that there will always be a chance to return. Calling in is a practice of loving each other enough to allow each other to make mistakes. Calling one another back into covenant means reminding one another that it is not our mistakes that define us, but the way in which we learn and grow from those mistakes. It means remembering that the world is actually not saved by our self-righteousness, but by our love. It means remembering that being in right relationship is sometimes more important than being right. As Reverend Gretchen Haley writes, what our faith asks of us, what our faith imagines for us, is that somehow, right at that moment when our hearts break, we will find a way to see through that heartbreak. We will stay put, not close off, not run away, not hurt back, but keep on being in relationship, doing what we can to repair the world and each other. Keep on opening our hearts with greater love. In this, our covenantal community, may we indeed set our aspirations high for how we wish to be with one another. May we promise we'll try our best to live into those aspirations. And when we fall short, may we love each other enough to do the hard work of calling in. May it be so.
There'll be a fire burning in the temple of our peace. There'll be a soaring voice for our silent pleas. We will hold a broken circle and begin to pray. We will find the black and white in the gray, and we will be as one God, and we will be as one people, and we will be as one God, and we will be as one people. Soon, love, soon, love, soon, we will find illumination in unnatural light. You will travel 1,000 miles without leaving my side. We will find we never knew hatred ran so deep. Such a wide, wide chasm of faith to leap. And we will be as one God. And we will be as one people. And we will be as one God. And we will be as one people. Soon, love, soon. Soon, love, soon. There will be an evolution of the human soul. We will know that to be apart is to truly be whole. We will learn the pattern of the centuries rise and fall. We will know that the fate of one is the fate of all.